Welcome everybody. It's a really huge pleasure to introduce this professorial inaugural lecture by Toby Green, who's Professor of Precolonial and Lusophone African History and Culture in the departments of History and also Language, Literatures and Cultures. And Toby's been a professor now for about 3 years, and high time he had this celebration and had all of us here to celebrate this incredible achievement. And there are so many things I could say about Toby. He's been an extremely active member of our community at King's and has achieved so much during his time at King's. So I'm going to focus particularly on the Toby that I've got to know since late 2018 when I arrived in King's and focus on what he's achieved in this period. As many of you will know, Toby is one of our very impressive FBAs in the history department. We have this great group of fellows of the British Academy in our history department. It's a huge marker of esteem and marks his really immense achievements in his research field. He's the author of the 2012 book, The Rise of Transatlantic Slave Trade in Western Africa, 1300 to 1589. But I want to celebrate particularly his 2019 book, which I remember coming out and experiencing all of that wonderful joy around the reception of that book. And that's the book A Fistful of Shells, West Africa from the Rise of the Slave Trade to the Age of Revolution. And that book, you will have seen it across all of the media when it came out. It was awarded the British Academy Book Prize and the American Historical Association Jerry Bentley Prize in World History. And it was shortlisted for the Cunhill History Prize, the LA Times Book Prize, and the Wolfson History Prize. I mean, this is a really impressive roster and a really incredible marker of esteem for this work. And this amazing study charts Africa's place in a globalized network of trade and a movement from Africa being a more sort of equal partner in that globalized economy to one whose political and economic power was damaged dramatically as the terms of that global exchange changed with the slave trade. And the book has rightly and widely been celebrated by those within the academic world, but also, crucially, those beyond the academic world, as a real transformative moment in this research field. And sticking with Toby's research, but turning to a slightly different strand in his research now, one of the aspects of Toby's work that I have found most fascinating since I've known Toby is his work on COVID. And this is such essential and such eye-opening work that really, for me, transformed that debate around COVID, which has dominated quite a lot of the last 5 years in the public imagination, I think, this pandemic. And Toby's written 2 books and over 50 articles, focusing mainly on the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic in the global south. And he's addressed a side panel of the UN high-level political meeting in July 2023. He's organized a conference on Africa's experience of COVID involving senior diplomats and politicians from Africa at the Royal United Services Institute. That was just in March 2024. And I would say that Toby's been playing a really crucial role in shining a light on the consequences of actions taken in the West to the communities in Africa. And sometimes it's all too easy to forget what's going on in that way in this very real globalized community. But our news feeds tend to be very selective in what they prioritize to us. And I think one of Toby's great virtues is his way of trying to get other stories on the agenda, other stories on the table, getting us to see things from other perspectives. And this research has powered Toby's contribution more broadly at King's. He's helped to lead internationalization in both of his 2 departments, particularly arranging student exchanges, which have been really transformative for our student body with institutions in Ghana, Peru, Spain, and the Netherlands. and helping build links with the Black Cultural Archives, which has now turned into a more formal connection with King's, which is really fabulous. And he's also played a strong role in building links with East London schools, with the History Teachers Hub, as part of his broader curriculum work. So this work has not only been transformative of the research field, it's transformed the curriculum, it's transformed the experience of our students at King's, it's had very thoroughgoing ramifications and ripples, I think, across the institution in a very positive way. And what's held together all of this work, and what's been the most striking feature, I guess, for me, of Toby, is his unwavering commitment to raising our awareness of our position in an interconnected world, and a world in which Africa is a much closer neighbour than we generally led to believe, and what you might guess by, as I say, looking at the priority given to various places in the news headlines that we read. And Toby's work keeps on the agenda that question of what that relationship is in a particularly rich and fruitful and thought-provoking form. Beyond King's, Toby's also worked with African institutions on some really fascinating projects. In terms of education, he's worked with our colleague at King's, Vincent Hira-Barron, and colleagues in the Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Ghana, on developing a new textbook, a free textbook resource for school children in Africa, sitting the WASSCE history exam. He's worked with colleagues in Africa to help establish a new research network for Lusophone Africa, and he's one of 2 members from outside the continent of the Pan-African Epidemic and Pandemic Working Group, a group of senior academics and politicians from across Africa collaborating on future pandemic process. So what you'll see in tonight's lecture, I think, is what you see in all of Toby's work, which is that incredible purpose, energy, and dedication that is second to none. And I was saying to Toby earlier, I find in his work a particularly coherent and driven agenda that goes throughout all of the work he does. And I think I would say his work is both brilliant and committed in a way that's always a joy to encounter and a joy to behold. And you're going to see that, I know, in the lecture tonight. So just before I pass over to Toby, I just want to welcome our 2 guests tonight who are going to be respondents to Toby's lecture. We're delighted to have them with us too for this occasion. Both Analithia Aranjo, a historian and professor at the Department of History in Howard University in Washington, D.C. in the US. And Anna specializes in the history and memory of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and is interested in the visual and material culture of slavery. And Jose Nafafe, an associate professor of African and Atlantic history in the Department of Hispanic, Portuguese, Latin American Studies at the University of Bristol, where he was also the first director of the MA in Black Humanities. So thank you so much to both of you for coming along, and we'll hear from you in about 45 minutes. But for now, let us welcome very, very warmly Toby Green.
Okay. Thank you, Mariam. I have a lapel mic, so I think I'm okay. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's great to have a rite of passage. I haven't had one for a while, so I'm looking forward to this one. It's customary on such occasions to thank one's predecessors. These aren't actually my words. Those are the opening words of the inaugural lecture from March 12, 1997, of my own predecessor as a professor in Lusophone African Studies here at King's, the late Patrick Chabal, who's known and remembered to many here tonight. And as we see, 27 years ago, a nice little booklet was made of inaugural lectures. So that night in 1997, Chabal continued, however, that as he had no predecessors in the field, either in King's or anywhere else in the UK for that matter, he was going to have to improvise. In the parts of West Africa that I've come to know and love over my decades of adult life, I've learned that it's also customary at the outset of any public title-giving ceremony like this to pay homage to those who've gone before us, without whom we won't be able to either take on the role or to fulfill the demands that it asks of us. Scholars must acknowledge their teachers because they've not come by their knowledge alone, in spite of, we might add in parentheses, the shibboleth in Western academia that this is solitary work. Indeed, it's interesting to consider the many parallels between scholarship in West Africa and in our own environment here at the outset of this lecture, because among scholars in the Sahel and in Senegambia, it's very common, as it is, of course, in Western institutions, to travel around a great deal in the early years of apprenticeship and learning from one teacher and their wisdom to another, until ready to settle down in some place which lends itself to reflection, surrounded by books, so carefully and painfully acquired, and of course by students who have the youthful idealism and passion for learning that is such a beautiful aspect of human nature. So unlike Chabal, I don't have to improvise. He's my predecessor as a professor of Lusophone African Studies at King's. And alongside tonight, somebody else who worked for many years in King's in the field of Lusophone African history, Malin Hewitt, formerly Charles Boxer Professor in the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, a historian of Mozambique, whose work with Patrick's really helps define the field of Lusophone African history in that time, in the UK in particular, but also more broadly. And in fact, Malin organised the conference at which José Nafafe and I met 20 years ago here at King's, so thank you for that, Malin. So I wouldn't be giving this lecture here tonight had that work not been done. Talking of Patrick, in an era when many talk about interdisciplinarity without necessarily practicing it, Patrick embodied that. He was as happy and comfortable talking to the Mozambican poet José Crivellini as he was to the sociologist from Guinea-Bissau, Leopoldo Amado. He understood that for those who research Africa, the narrow rigidity of Western academic disciplines obscure far more than they reveal. And I learnt many things from Patrick in the brief years when we worked together here at King's. That, as his one-time co-author Jean-Pascal Dalloz said at his memorial conference in 2014, you can go a long way with a title and a table of contents, something that I've put to the test myself in recent times. That it's important to be able to smile as well as suffer whatever pain we're undergoing. In the sad weeks after his death, I also learned much of the scholar's craft going through his library. I discovered here that as a young man and as a passionate bibliophile, he had collected an almost unique collection of literature from Cameroon, where he had worked as a volunteer teacher in the late 1970s. His was an office that overflowed with books of materiality with thought. His presence dealt there, and when Abdul Karim and Malin and I went through his collection of books in the sad years after his death, we learned a lot about that. And in the years since, I've reflected that what I learned was the importance of spaces of learning in the reproduction of traditions of scholarship. These spaces of learning so often coincide with the spaces to accumulate the wisdom of others. As the libraries of Timbuktu show, this is a feature of scholarship in West Africa also, as of course it is in many societies around the world. And this was also something that was my privilege to learn from the second predecessor I want to pay homage to this evening, my doctoral supervisor, Paulo Farias. Now, it's a great sadness to me that Paulo, who is nearly 90 now, couldn't be here this evening. I remember our first meeting, which was at his office at the University of Birmingham in the now defunct Centre of West African Studies. It was in January or February 2002. I arrived a little late, entered a room where a collection of books gasped from the shelves, and as I sat there, I sort of looked on the shelves behind Paulo, and I saw the 5 volumes of the classic work, México a través de los siglos, creaking on the shelves behind him. And after 2.5 hours, it was me who said to Paulo, I'm going to have to go now to catch my train. He was quite happy to continue talking, and actually our supervisions would often last 4 or 5 hours. By that time, he had retired. But I was, at that point, still a young, somewhat arrogant man, but I do remember thinking as I left, I could learn something here. And looking back, I'd already begun learning about the importance of giving time to young people, to listen to them in all their bluster and confusion, which we've all been through ourselves, to harness as much of their idealism as we still can as we age, which is, of course, one of the huge privileges of this job, to impart, too, the way in which stillness, reflection, and the accumulated wisdom and consolation of the thoughts of others are absolute prerequisites for scholarship, teaching, and their implied care for the reproduction of the human realm. I started my PhD in the autumn of 2002, a year before Paolo retired. That autumn he was on sabbatical, preparing what he euphemistically described to me as a book. I brought it with me here this evening. Medieval Arabic Inscriptions from the Republic of Mali was a book which received and has continued to receive what I can only describe as bardic praise, which I'm not sure I can emulate here this evening. On its publication, it was said by reviewers to be a book whose like we would not see again. This was because Paolo had a career which probably nobody will ever have again in Western academia as it's currently constituted, because he spent his entire career producing this book, which he published the year he retired, and the reason it took him so long was because it was based on years of travel to Mali and Mauritania, where he conducted research in cemeteries, deciphering funerary inscriptions from those cemeteries from the 14th and 15th centuries, and drawing on those to rewrite the collective history of the Mali and Songhai empires as a history not just of conflict and division, but also of shared cultural and religious heritage, of coexistence and cooperation. So in this way, I was fortunate enough to be taught by one of the people who's done most in the West to delineate structures of pre-colonial West African history and historiography. Since the 1960s, in dialogue with many scholars, Paolo's work literally shaped this field. So without this exemplar, I wouldn't be giving this lecture here this evening. And then there's a third person without whom I wouldn't be here tonight and to whom I wish to pay homage in the tradition which I've already explored at the beginning of this lecture. And this is one of my oldest friends anywhere on this earth, Alhaji Mamadou Ndiaye. I met Alhaji almost 30 years ago in December 1995 in a bicycle repair shop in the small town of Bula in Guinea-Bissau. We've been through a lot in the years since, working together in many ways. I sent Alhaji an email about an hour and a half ago. It was his friendship, knowledge, and willingness to transcend the massive boundaries which separated us at birth, which has perhaps done most to instill in me my passion and fascination for the West African past, and certainly without him I wouldn't be here this evening. Now, at the moment, I'm not going to dwell on what he's taught me, because I'm going to spend some part of this lecture dwelling on Alhaji's life and its relevance to general historical understanding, but he has sent a short message this evening, which I'm going to play now, if I can. Here we go.
Bonsoir. Toby m'a expliqué.
Can we see the... Maybe I have to close the PowerPoint? Can try. Yes, okay.
Donné un discours. Je dois parler de mon histoire. Il y a une dizaine d'années, je lui ai dit qu'un jour, il fallait qu'il parle de notre histoire, de ma vie. Donc je suis heureux qu'il le fera ce soir à un public. Bon. Moi, je suis né à Ziguinchor. En 1975, mon père était affecté à Dakar. Je suis revenu parce que j'étais têtu. On m'a envoyé au village pour passer faire les études. Bon, j'ai fait mes études en Casamance. Après, je suis allé à Dakar, travailler à Dakar. Mais pas de travail fixe. J'ai quitté Dakar pour la Guinée-Bissau. C'est là-bas que j'ai rencontré Toby. Il était avec son ami Evan. Ils étaient deux en bicyclette. Bon, je les ai gardé leur bicyclette. Quand ils sont revenus, ils m'ont offert une bicyclette pour mon travail. Moi, j'étais photographe. Auparavant, j'étais photographe. Mais actuellement, je suis tailleur, je fais la couture. Toby est revenu en 2000 au Sénégal. Il m'avait trouvé très malade. Quand il m'avait dit de venir, il va venir au Sénégal, je lui ai accordé sa visite. Il ne savait même pas que j'étais malade. C'est là-bas, dans cette maladie, que j'ai perdu un doigt. Vous voyez, j'ai passé une vie très, très difficile dans ma vie. À cause de Toby, vraiment, je me suis soigné. Il m'a beaucoup aidé. Financièrement, il m'a soutenu. Sur tous les plans, il m'a soutenu, Toby. C'est mon frère. Toby n'est pas mon ami actuellement. Actuellement, ce n'est pas mon ami, c'est un frère à moi. c'est un frère à moi. C'est pour ça, toujours, à chaque fois que je prie, je lui souhaite une longue vie de santé, de fer. C'est un travailleur, Toby. Il bosse beaucoup. On marchait des kilomètres par jour. Partout en Guinée-Bissau, on a foulé le sol, de Conakry, Guinée-Bissau. Dans les voitures, dans les montagnes, partout on est allé. Et moi, ma vie, c'est pas facile d'expliquer ma vie une bonne fois. Je ferai un très grand film, de long métrage pour parler de moi. Ouais, Toby, vraiment, je ne peux pas parler de Toby parce que ça me fait des émotions. Parce qu'on a passé de très très durs moments ensemble. Il était venu pour travailler, pour faire des recherches. Mais ça a passé, on a fait des recherches comme des fous. On a bossé comme des fous. Moi, je ne pouvais pas prendre son rythme. Il travaillait beaucoup, il marchait beaucoup. On faisait même des kilomètres par jour, des vingtaines de kilomètres par jour en Guinée-Bissau. Guinée-Conakry, la même chose. Mais partout où il va, il s'adapte. J'ai connu sa femme, Émilie, quand il était venu en 2000, avant leur mariage. Émilie est venue nous rejoindre au Sénégal. On est allé le chercher à l'aéroport. Bon. On est allé en Guinée-Conakry avec Émilie, une semaine et quelques. Émilie est retournée pour revenir en Angleterre. Toby, vraiment, c'est un ami à moi. La vie est difficile. En Afrique, c'est pas facile. C'est pas facile. Avec nos dirigeants, ils bossent pour eux-mêmes, mais pas pour la population. Ils bossent pour leurs enfants, pour leur famille, leurs amis, mais pas pour nous, la population. Ouais, Toby, c'est un lion. En Wolof, on dit c'est un gaïndé, c'est un lion. Toby is a lion. Lion. He's not my friend, Toby. You are my brother. You are my brother. Parce qu'on a vécu beaucoup de temps ensemble. Ça fait plus de 30 ans d'amitié. Ça, c'est pas de l'amitié. Maintenant, c'est mon frère, Toby.
Oh.
Bonsoir.
Hang on. I'd like to give Elijah a round of applause. So, those of you who could understand, I've had my own homage from Elijah, as you heard. So that's also as it should be in an event like that, in an event like this. And Elijah is present in another way because he made me this shirt. As he mentioned, he's a tailor. He gave me this shirt last time I saw him, which was a year ago. And so I wanted very much to wear that here this evening. Now, by this point, some of you may be confused a bit as to the way in which this lecture is unfolding, because it's perhaps not as traditional as it seemed. It would be. The homage to predecessors, which Patrick Chabal mentioned in 1997, is usually briefer than this. What I have done is to take a very British tradition and then place it squarely within a West African setting, a space in which time does not dictate events. Rather, as the French philosopher Alain Badiou would understand, events dictate time. The right time to conclude this introduction is not at 6:15 or 6:30, but when the introduction and requisite homages have been made. A prolonged disquisition about title holders who precede us may not be the way in which scholars these days tend to instantiate the significance of their work, but it's how I've chosen this evening to instantiate the significance of African perspectives and how they've educated me in the broadest sense. And also how they interrupt, challenge, and are yet systematically excluded to this day from the Western Academy. I'm really grateful to my friends and colleagues Alain, Lucia and José, who I know will take the bull by the horns and broaden this interruption into something bigger. Because what I hope the introduction does is foreground just how different historical discourses and methods are, how false the assumption of universalism in constructing historical canons and traditions can be, and that can make for uncomfortable thinking. Why are these perspectives so challenging? How can they help us to rethink many of the urgent crises we face? My discussion this evening is going to suggest that by reflecting on the detail of individual African lives, like that of one of my oldest friends, Alaji, we can understand all of this better. He once said to me, as he said just now, that we should write something together about his own life. As you may have heard, he'd like to make a long film about his own life, and it's my honour to be able to recast this a little bit in my own homage to him and the way in which he's enabled me to be here this evening. So, having paid my dues, I pose the question at the core of this lecture: why has pre-colonial African history been in steep decline since the 1980s? Indeed, the question can become a bit broader. Why, when the A-Level Board OCR assessment approached the Royal Historical Society in 2013, wanting to develop an option in earlier African history, was I the only historian at a Russell Group history department at that time, specialising in the history of Africa before 1800? Here's my spoiler summary. African life histories and modes of African narratives interrupt the language of history in the Western Academy. So teaching African history is generally ascribed to the period since 1800 to modern history. Hegel was right. Africa has no history before colonization, or even before more or less the period in which he was at work. To eliminate the question, I can turn to my dear colleague José Nafafe. Some of you may respond, José is teaching pre-colonial history, which is true, but as we heard from Marion, José teaches in the Department of Hispanic and Portuguese Studies at Bristol, not in the history department. I too have always taught in modern languages here in history, as well as history here at King's. It makes sense for scholars of pre-colonial history in the UK need to have a close attention to language, to multiple languages and their registers of power. At this point, I also want to make clear just why working in a department teaching Portuguese has been so important to my career as a historian. As we see with Ana Lucia and José tonight, the Portuguese-speaking world has been pivotal in the transformation of the historiography of pre-colonial Africa. A clear majority of scholars working on pre-colonial Africa in the Western Academy today come from Brazil and the Lusophone world. I can think beyond Ana Lucia and José. I can think of scholars like Mariana Cândido, Mariana Dias-Pais, Roquinaldo Ferreira, Vanessa Oliveira, and many, many others. Working in a Portuguese-speaking and teaching environment has therefore been crucial in shaping a new view of history, an environment I've been so privileged to be a part of here at King's. We can consider language and its use a bit further for a moment. Some will criticise the use of the word pre-colonial, giving too much weight to colonialism in African history. The other option for this time period is to describe it as early modern, which doesn't seem to me much of an improvement, privileging the Western subdivision of history related to what the Portuguese termed the Age of Discoveries. At least focusing on the pre-colonial emphasises the interruption which this might bring to the language of history. Then there's the term Lusophone, privileging the Portuguese language and not Quimbundo, Crioulo, Balanto, or Kigongo. On the other hand, if we were to ignore Portuguese, we wouldn't be able to teach the novels of Pepe Tela or Paulina Tiziani and what they too can teach us about the history of Africa. And this relates to a key aspect of African history, the use of colonial languages in the production of literature, law and society ever since independence, which remains a core question, as shown in the recent essay by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the Senegalese writer Boubacar Boris Diop, directed to the new president of Senegal, Bassirou Faye, that to achieve substantive decolonization, a resolution of the language issue is vital. In sum, problems of history are also problems of language in Africa. One of the things that's most fascinating and striking about the huge literature on decolonization is, however, that much of it is written in English. Some may feel that, as is said in Kiswahili, haba na haba huchasa kibaba, little by little fills up the pot. That is, we need to start slowly. But until we can speed up, that's why historians such as José and myself are fortunate to work with both historians and linguists. All this is a preamble to just understanding the state of these fields, the fields I'm privileged to be a professor of here at King's, means understanding the context of disciplines in our environment. First, the Lusophone question. Portuguese was always privileged at King's because of the foundation by the Duke of Wellington and his role in the Peninsular Wars. That's why the subject was taught as early as the middle of the 19th century. Why there was a Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies presided over by Charles Buxer in the post-war years. Why Patrick Chabal was therefore able to add an African dimension to the department when he arrived in 1984. In other words, institutions have their own history, grounded in power and inequality, which also then change as the world changes around them. Another aspect of that, of course, is the fact that my title holders who have preceded me have said there's a certain gender dimension, which some of you may have noticed, and we can hope that as the world is changing, that may also too now change. In sum, this can explain the context of different historical fields, including that of pre-colonial African history. History as a discipline in the West emerged as a way of producing a form of national mythology when religious mythologies were on the wane. Tied to nationalism, this inevitably meant in the Anglosphere, Africa was included as a subfield of imperial history. Decolonization in the 1960s didn't mean that that suddenly ended, and that was why historians of Africa in the UK tended to work initially in area studies departments that had been formed in the early 60s as part of strategic investment in the Cold War. In the UK, that meant Centre for West African Studies at Birmingham, SOAS, of course, here, and Edinburgh. Geopolitics may have produced the financing and institutional momentum for area studies, but what institutions did with it is something else. In the UK, the great heyday was the 60s and the 70s. Paolo and others who knew Birmingham at the time would often tell me that that was the real heyday. Almost all the MA and PhD students in departments came from Africa, funded by generous government programs, keen to train the new generation of post-generation leaders, and well aware of the importance of a deep sense of history in doing that. But it came to an end in the late 70s and the early 80s. First, of course, there was the oil crisis, which led to a debt crisis in Africa in the late 1970s. This led to the World Bank and the IMF moving in, imposing reforms known as structural adjustment. Public spending had to be cut. Public goods had to be sold off. External consultants moved in to advise on institutional reform, and surprisingly enough, they had little time for pre-colonial history. What would it produce? Or to put this question another way around, did these consultants in fact understand that a deep grounding in national histories is essential to produce the sense of strong national identity and culture from which the optimism and energy needed to transform societies can come? That grounding had, after all, been a key partner to modernization in the West and to the role of history. Still, over the next 30 years, this process of making history seem useless, which coincided with the rise of structural adjustment, was pursued so ruthlessly that history as a subject in its own right ceased to be taught in Nigerian secondary schools for much of the 2010s. In recent years, many of us may feel that this strategy honed in the global south is now returning to the global north, something which actually happens with a number of policies. On the other hand, and also from the early 80s onwards, the rise of Fortress Europe in the US made it increasingly harder for scholars based in Africa to secure visas so that they could come to institutions in the West for exchange and periods of archival research. As this potted history indicates, structural adjustment in Africa and the hostile environment were part of the same socio-economic process, known under the general term neoliberalism. Essentially, through initiating economic warfare on Africa, Western institutions made it far more likely that Africans might seek to migrate to the West, which was reaping the profits of this assault. The other side of this same coin was therefore the hostile environment, which shows too that challenging the hostile environment without addressing the massive economic warfare of structural adjustment will achieve little. In sum, this history of my disciplines tells us some important things. First, that histories of power and inequality shape the institutions that we work in and the disciplines that we teach. Changing the content won't necessarily change that dynamic. Second, that what seems anachronistic today may have been the height of progressivism yesterday. In the first half of the 20th century, it was liberals in the West who most favoured empire in Africa, a fact often forgotten today, because this was a way of bringing, progress. In the 1960s, there was rarely a question of teaching African history in history departments in the UK for the reasons I've outlined, so area studies and then modern languages stepped in. And this was necessary, for otherwise there would have been no scholarship produced on Africa, no reciprocal exchanges, as they were before the hostile environment, no one to teach future students of Africa in the West. However, these days African studies is increasingly critiqued as a hangover of imperialism, as it also undoubtedly is and was. Third, we can conclude that we have to attend carefully to the changes we now witness as many departments and institutions rush to bring Africa into their offerings. For if Africa is simply incorporated within existing frameworks, which precisely emerged through imbalances of power, through inequality, it may be that not much will actually change. For while Africa is now incorporated into Western academic life, while Africa is present in many departments, such that centres which focus on Africa seem outdated, while hundreds and in places thousands of people may attend conferences about the continent, it's not clear that much has changed in terms of the language in the Western Academy around African lives and African histories. I say this because the debates in the last few decades, however alive and contentious they've been, have tended to ignore this continual acceleration of what can only be described, as I've just indicated, as Western economic warfare waged on Africa and Africans. intensifying decade on decade since the structural adjustment program of the 1980s, which I've mentioned, aggravated by the arrival of the Chinese on the scene in the 2000s, some often going fairly unremarked in the Western Academy. And this can become clear in some specific examples. We often hear these days about climate poverty in Africa, and of course there is a relationship between climate and poverty. But of course to pretend that this is the only cause is a misrepresentation, hiding the role of institutions in our own countries in this economic assault. Understanding these processes in more detail, I want to return now to Alaji, to put an African life at the centre of this history. As I said earlier, we've known each other for near on 30 years, and as he said too. And I've learnt a lot about his family in those times, as he has of mine. So Alaji's patronym is Njai. The Njais were Wolof from the north of today's Senegal, but he was born in the southern Casamance region. His father's grand and great-grandparents migrated south in the early 19th century. They came as middlemen in the groundnut trade, then springing up across Senegambia in response to the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. Many collective farms were established in Casamance, southern Senegal, and in today's Guinea-Bissau, where groundnuts were farmed and traded to the French and Portuguese through middlemen, people like the Njais. And their intermediary role was a key phase in the economic and social change of the period. However, his grandmother was not a Wolof. She came from today's Guinea-Bissau and belonged to the Manjaco people. The Manjaco were from this region, offshore, on the mainland opposite the Bijagos Islands. And they shared many religious practices with peoples further inland, the Pepel and Mankagne people, for example. They were traders and cultural brokers in the Atlantic in the previous centuries, just as the Njais of Casamance were in the 19th century. So, Alaji's grandparents met in the aftermath of the wars of conquest in Guinea-Bissau prosecuted by the Portuguese, in which they'd relied on African troops in their wars of pacification. One of their main military allies was Adun Njai, who became something like a warrant chief in Guinea-Bissau under Portuguese control, commanding forces of people who moved from Casamance to fight with him. Njai had been a merchant of Senegal who moved to Bissau in the late 1880s. As the historian Joy Bowman has shown us, he eventually developed power which threatened the Portuguese, and they captured and deported him in 1919. He remains widely remembered in Casamance and Guinea-Bissau, and 25 years ago, I spent an afternoon with Alaji listening to a griot singing a memorial of Njai's deeds. However, on Alaji's mother's side, things were very different again. His mother came from a Maraboutic family, a scholarly Islamic family. Her mother was a Jahanke. The Jahanke were itinerant scholars who followed the Suwerian branch of Islam. By the late 16th century, they were settled on the mid-Gambia River around the town of Soutougo, and from here they travelled throughout Senegambia and Guinea-Bissau. They often had trains of people in tow who they would teach, writing verses of the Quran in ink onto the wooden boards known as aluas, and then rubbing them off as more were taught and learned. The Jahanke traded goods from one settlement to the next, financing this work, and they were key in the religious and cultural history of the Senegambia, as the historian Lamine Sané has shown. To complete the family tree, there's Alaji's father. He was a Sarakhole Mandinka, and I will just... He had been born in Mauritania in the late 19th century. Mauritania was one of the centres of religious teachings in the Sahel. After the fall of Timbuktu to armies from Morocco in 1591, many of the scholars from Timbuktu actually dispersed, and as the historian Charles Stewart has shown, many of them went to Mauritania. Then at some point in the early years of the 20th century, his father had, this grandfather had come to Casamance. Now this journey is the subject of great mystery in the family. In the year 2000, I was talking to Alaji, and a friend of his told me that this grandfather of Alaji's had flown, or effectively teleported himself from Mauritania. Why had he done this? To escape a firing squad during the violence of the French pacification programs. Alaji put it to me like this: things were getting hot. He was there, and then he was here. In sum, that's the family background of Alaji's, which he shared with me over the years. Impossible to summarize adequately. But it gives us some windows into exactly how and why African lives pose a challenge to the language of history as we know it here. Because Western historical analysis is based upon hard categories, which may have little meaning in an African context. We can consider, for instance, the category of ethnicity. When I met Alaji, I assumed, because of his patronym, Njai, that he was Wolof. But it turned out one grandmother was Manjako. His grandfather on his mother's side was a Serachole Mandinka, part of a scholarly family, series of families from Mauritania. His grandmother on his grandmother on that side was a Jahanke, was from the Jahanke communities. I only unravelled this with his help and permission after many years, and discovering thereby that the history of just one individual tears, in many ways, the entire anthropology of ethnicity to pretty much almost to shreds, on which much contemporary political science of Africa is still based. On the other hand, his family's lives were structured, as we learned, on movement. His father walked with two brothers to Mecca in the 1930s to perform the Hajj, a journey that took 3 years. His paternal grandfather's family, as we've seen, had come from the north of Senegal to Casamance and then Guinea-Bissau. On his mother's side, his maternal grandmother's family had come from a line of itinerant preachers constantly travelling around Senegambia and also into today's Mali. And his grandfather, as we've seen, had come from Mauritania and then also from families who had previously come from Timbuktu to Mauritania. What this all teaches us is that the only thing that was static and without historical change in this world region was the perception of it by outsiders, such as Hegel. How should historians understand this movement? It's pretty clear, on the one hand, it was driven by commerce, linked to extractive external forces, as the movement of his great-great-grandparents to the Casamance in the 19th century to work with the ground-up production was. But on the other hand, this movement was clearly driven by religious motivations, by the preaching vocation of the Jahanke, by the supernatural abilities of his grandfather. But Western historical analysis resides largely in materialist economic analysis, ignores at best and belittles at worst spiritual explanatory paradigms. I've discussed this with many colleagues in West Africa, the question being, how is it possible, really, to analyse the region's history and pass over spirituality completely? If historians cannot take seriously the main categories of analysis and understanding which people have of their own experiences and histories, the question arises how effective their analyses can be, how they can avoid freighting in their own prejudices. All this shows how African life history so often will provide an enduring critique to the Western analytic and historical discourse. This may indicate a major reason why the Western Academy finds it hard to bring African perspectives fully into its discourse and language, because, as Alaji's family shows, it's so vital that that individual African lives should be included fully in our discourse in the West. They provide the kind of sustained critical balance of an academic world, which these days aims so often to find a consensus, and yet with hard-edged categories and a materialist discourse, which is anything but universal. In that way, consensus soon becomes effectively just another statement of power. The place of contemporary African lives in discourses of power is even harder to find inclusion for. What's happening now? And Alaji's own life story, which he narrated himself 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, shows us this beyond doubt. I met him in 1995 in the town of Bula in northern Guinea-Bissau. He was working, as he mentioned in the film, as a photographer. And this was the era before mobile phones, which some of us remember. You didn't take 100 photos and select 2. There was a skill in ensuring you took the right one at the right moment. So what did he used to do? He used to go to wait outside the nightclub in Bula. He would wait for people to come out who wanted their photographs taken. He'd take the photos. He would then go into Bissau, which was and get them developed. And then when he had the photos, he'd go back to Bula. That took about a day. And then people would pay him, the people who commissioned him would pay him for that. So that way he could earn a living, buy more films, and get more equipment, set up a studio. So by 1998, his business was going very well. He later told me that he had saved over £2,000, which was a lot of money in those days in Guinea-Bissau. Then the civil war began in the country, and he lost everything. He gave money to those who had nothing to eat. At one time he told me he had over 50 people in his compound, and eventually he had to walk out of the country and came back to Senegal with nothing. We next met the following year. He mentioned I arrived to do some research. We went together to Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, also in Senegal. And when I left, I paid him for the work, all that work, by setting him up with the money to buy a taxi. he dreamed of coming to Europe. Because as his experiences already showed him, those who save money in West Africa and don't come from the elite are required to spend it helping others when a crisis hits. So he then spent too much of this money for the taxi. He gave it over to someone who said he could arrange a visa and smuggle him to Europe. That person disappeared with the money, and he spent the remainder kitting out a tailor's workshop, which he established in a working-class suburb in Dakar. And here's a photo of him at the workshop. And that was around 2001. And Elhadji then spent about a decade working in Dakar, earning a decent living. His family moved from Guinea-Bissau to be with him, but by the end of the 2000s, Dakar was becoming a very hard city for ordinary Senegalese people to live in because the presence of the NGO sector, its popularity for international conferences and the like, all made rents increasingly unaffordable. So in the end, he moved with his family and his capital, his sewing machines, his tailoring equipment, back to Guinea-Bissau, to the town of Bula, where we'd met in 1995. But working there wasn't easy either, largely because of the lack of reliable electricity. He had his own generator, which was oil-powered. It was very expensive and often broke down. I saw him running it when I visited in 2011. So a few years later, around 2016, he returned to Casamance. And there he was able to buy a motorbike and set about a new business. He used to ride for 3 hours to the coast, to the fishing port of Kafountine. In Kafountine, he would buy fish, take it back to the market in the town he lived in, and the business prospered. And I met him in 2018 in the Gambia. He rode up to the airport in Banjul on his motorbike. We shared a room in the hotel at the conference I was involved in, and we quickly fell into old times, teasing each other until we said, well, we're going to have to go to the beach and sort this one out. So he was definitely a member of the Senegalese middle class. Things have worked out by and by. That all ended in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. The movement restrictions meant it was impossible for him to travel to the coast to Kafountine. And meantime, both he and everyone around spent all the savings they had in order to be able to eat, which was pretty inevitable in a country where 85% of the population earn their living through the informal sector requiring movement and access to markets. People were eating just once a day. Large numbers of the young people left to try the back way across the Sahara to Europe, in which so many people lose their lives. One friend in the Gambia told me last year he estimated about 1 in 5 people who do that journey die on the way. By the time the COVID restrictions ended, his savings were shot through, and by the middle of 2021, he had little or nothing left, and Senegal had changed, seeming to be sliding towards dictatorship as the President Macky Sall tried to shore up power that no one respected anymore. But at that point, he was able to find work making a series of films for a Western charity about the social and economic impact of all this on the communities around him in Senegal, returning appropriately to the work of making images, which is what he was doing when I first met him. That business came to an end in time as well. In the end, as the Wolof proverb puts it, vo bire, jafina dewa, the song of the stomach, is hard to hear. And so what's left now for Elhadji in his hometown in Casamance is the need for a new reconstruction and the difficulty surrounding that. As with the historical dimensions of his own family history, I think his life again shows just how readily African biographies interrupt standard conceptual frameworks, which we regularly deploy in the Western Academy. One example would be the concept of social entrepreneurship. Very much a buzzword heard in business schools around economic frameworks, especially in the Global South. I have been involved in a work project in which I was somewhat catapulted into, dealing with the topic of social entrepreneurship in Angola and Mozambique. I think Elhadji's life shows what a complete waste of time this is, because in most African environments, if you're not a social entrepreneur, you will struggle to survive. Then there's the question of neocolonialism. He mentioned this in his talk. Every time we speak, almost, he will complain both about the depredation of Western forces and about the governing class in Senegal. This is not a new view. In his classic book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney argued that there had been a historical dynamic of an alliance of Western and African elites at the expense of the African poor. In other words, a class-based analysis was essential for grasping the root causes of economic exploitation and impoverishment. But it often seems to me that in the current Western Academy, such analyses are somewhat out of fashion. I argued in A Fistful of Shells that intersectionality can and must include class as one of the core elements of its work. In sum, Elhadji's own life history shows that talking about neocolonialism should be every bit as much a core subject of academic discussion as decolonization, for it precisely links to the analysis of class. his life, and millions upon millions of lives like it make for an uncomfortable critique of various aspects of the contemporary academic world. And that's another reason why it's so hard to include such lives within the language of history as we study and teach it in the West, why it's so vital that we do so. Having been in the mode of criticism, I want to end this lecture with what can be brought more gloriously and positively into the Western Academy through the presence of African lives and discourses. And this isn't just about interruption and critique of established modes of thinking, but it's about the power and joy of speech. Anyone who spent much time at a conference in Africa, on the continent in any form, knows how important a pleasure speech is in daily life. The rigidity of time means little at a conference or in a lecture. The right time to finish or start is when the discussion ends, when speech has been given its due. It's not for nothing that history is in so many parts of the continent traditionally an oral genre, where praise should be long in the making and not formulated in the terse formulae of clean prose. So when giving this lecture, I need to give thanks and praise to all those whose speeches I've heard in Africa, the jellies and the griots, the lecturers and the professors, the many people I've spoken with whose very being already gives thanks to the power of speech and discussion. For what they've taught me is that it is through speech, and more importantly, debate and discussion, that we can most learn from one another, and that the idea that we ourselves can teach others when we feel afraid to say what we truly feel and believe seems the wrong way around. And yet, as many of us feel, these are sometimes features in the current academy. Many things are felt but rarely voiced, that the care for the human realm requires books, time, scholarship, all of which we feel are in ever shorter supply. That the rise of mobile devices makes the reading of books less and less current. And then yet the practice of scholarship, as we and others have learned it around the world, requires this reading and accumulation of books as a form of medicine for the spirit. That the purpose of a humanistic education in a world of AI needs to be rethought to prevent work itself being removed by the devices which now command us with their own formulae, which none of us understand. That there is a historic crisis we face as humans, confronted by the violence of our dreams of technological mastery and control, leading to all kinds of disgusting wars. That without speaking things we feel and know to be true, the academic world itself will eventually wither and die, and that without engaging in debate with those with whom we may disagree, we cannot challenge any of these trends. Many people feel that some of this, at least, may be true. However swept with rhetorical flourishes it might be, for the purposes, too, of giving praise to the voice, as I've had the privilege to learn to do in Africa. But at the same time, we seem to lack spaces in which to even broach these topics, or the broader courage which is required to tackle them head-on. Far from being good at having difficult conversations, I often feel we've never been so bad at it. Discussions about academic freedom continue, freedom of speech. I propose we should focus instead on the freedom to debate. For genuine debate requires listening, engaging with one another, and is one of the best ways to nurture the imaginative empathy which precludes hate speech. We need to learn to be able to have difficult conversations which cross divisions and can therefore, with time and immense mutual efforts, heal them. If we cannot, as scholars, do this, it's hard to see how we're going to teach young people to do so themselves. And to learn how to do this, we can turn to the power and beauty of the human voice itself, its capacity to unfurl beauty, but also to engage in conversation. For me, at least, that means to recall how the human voice is instantiated in the historical discourse of West Africa as I've learnt it, and in the narratives of countless lives, such as Alaji's, that express how much we have in common as human beings, whatever may divide us. And for the Western Academy, what this actually means is returning to roots. The roots of this academy lie in ancient Athens. That's fairly uncontroversial. In Plato's original academy, and in the Socratic dialogues which took place there to arrive at a view of truth and justice. As Walter Ong wrote in his classic work, Orality and Literacy, the agonistic dynamics of oral thought processes and expression have been central to the development of Western culture, where they were institutionalized by the art of rhetoric, by the related dialectic of Socrates and Plato. This was a world of orality and speech. And it was also a world influenced by Africa, as Martin Bernal showed in his classic 1989 book, Black Athena. In that book, Bernal argued that the historic Egyptian origins of Greek culture, which I gather has, in some realms of classical scholarship, is controversial, but is apparent to anyone who's read Herodotus, were erased in the 19th century Western Academy because of rising anti-black racism. From today's vantage point, we might in fact say that Africa's culture of orality, mediated through ancient Egyptian society, influenced the way in which Western academic thought first took shape in Athens. So my suggestion this evening is that African lives don't only provide a critical voice in the analysis of the Western Academy. Learning from African modes of knowledge production and the continent's historic culture of orality is vital if we are to renew academic life in the post-COVID world. But now, I've inevitably run over time. I failed to pay heed to the Wolof proverb, "Era waja buntuti, te dguelo, bobare." One must talk little and listen much. Or, as so many people in Africa also say, God knows best.
Good. Good evening. Thank you, Toby, for this beautiful and provocative lecture. It's, of course, a great pleasure to be here today with so many dear colleagues and friends. And Toby told us how the life and the work of his friend, Monsieur Njai, influenced his work. And he also told us how the work of his mentor, dear historian Paulo Farias, as well as the scholars Joselinha Nafafé, here with us, and Patrick Chabal with the ancestors, contributed to his work as well. Toby's early journey in Senegal and Guinea-Bissau when he was still a young man was crucial to shape his trajectory as the tenacious historian, and especially as the great magicien des mots, who transforms words into powerful speech and beautifully written speech. But I put aside the spell of Toby's moving speech, and instead I embraced Toby's invitation and address the limits of what he calls the language of history, by focusing then on three major limits of history as a mode of discourse, and how these limits are even bigger when addressing the African past. And the Africa, there are many Africas. The Africa I focus on here is inseparable from the African diaspora, the one that was formed from the dispersion of more than 12 million enslaved Africans, half of which were brought in chains to the country from where I come from, Brazil. So, Toby's reflection on African lives and the language of history leads us to think about time, past and present, about words, about things, and about life and death. To a great extent, Toby's work over the past 20 years has been about these themes. And here I refer to what he wrote even before he decided it was a good decision to become an academic historian. And also his most recent works, including then the 2 books on COVID and the new one in West Africa that is coming soon. So, although I take here a different path, as a historian who works on the memory and the history of memory that I am, I want to engage 3 dimensions of his argument during his lecture. The first one, the language of history, as I called it in a recent book, or history as a mode of discourse, which is the term that I use, cannot appropriately address the past in the present. Second, the language of history, or history as a mode of discourse, cannot properly address the African past and the African experience. Third, and finally, the language of history, or history as a mode of discourse, cannot fully address the elephant in the room, or anti-Black African racism, which is the oldest son of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism, the same anti-Black racism that shaped in so many ways the rise of the academic disciplines in fields such as African history, African studies, African anthropology in European and US universities. So what I argue here is that whereas history as a mode of discourse in the so-called West is about the past, only memory as a mode of discourse can grasp this past in the present. We historians not only aim to establish facts, we examine, select, classify, organize, and interpret these facts in the light of existing evidence. So, normative history produced by academic historians is this organized account that attempts to explain the past. Yet, we as historians, we rarely witness the events we narrate. Very often, we have no direct access to the social actors who witness the experience we recount. So, despite our aims of objectivity, and in many cases our serious attempts to tell the truth, history written by us historians is also biased and is also often racialized. As the late dear friend David Lowenthal observed, and he was not a historian, historians are aware, and I quote, "they cannot avoid manipulating the evidence," unquote. And then, in his magnus opus, The Past is a Foreign Country, David also reminded us that, like memory, history, quote, conflates, exaggerates, abridges. What is crucial or unique is made to stand out. Uniformities and minutiae fade away, unquote. So, although the matter, the substance of history is the human past, only memory can seize human experience. Yes, Toby is a historian, one who studies the distant African past, but he is also one who also recognizes the power of the present and the power of the history of the present time. Toby's work as a historian was born in West Africa and was driven from the encounter with people like Monsieur Ndiaye, Paulo, and José, with whom he created ties of all kinds through words written and spoken, through thoughts and fights, and through emotions, friendship, and solidarity, and eventually through shared experiences, shared human experiences. And it's this human dimension that has shaped and perhaps shapes more than ever Toby's work right now. And this human dimension that orients his work about the people he met in the written and oral archives, and who got new life through his powerful words. These are people who were killed in the hold of the slave ships, who were imprisoned in the dungeons of the Inquisition, and whose lives were impoverished and made impossible during the COVID pandemic. Not because of the deadly virus, but because of the restrictive measures that were imposed on African countries, such as Senegal and Angola, that prevented children from going to school and therefore from eating, and preventing men and women to leave their households to gain their lives, doing all kinds of jobs, such as the ones Monsieur Njai has been doing throughout his life, as Toby well explained. So ultimately, Toby's question remains with us. Can the language of history grasp the magnitude of life and the tragedy of death? In a world where African lives and Black lives in the African diaspora continue to be devalued, can history at the end of the day address the human experience in all its dimensions, colors, textures, feelings? And in the case of Africa, can history help us come to terms with anti-Black racism, which in a great extent explains why African history and the history of the African diaspora remain absent from most university programs, not necessarily here in this country, but across the Americas and the African diaspora, while programs in the history of African diaspora in this country as well are being phased out. We see petitions circulating from times to times, including universities here in the London area. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, the language of history that Toby is committed to, and the language of history that he calls us to write, is also the language of memory, the one who centers evidence but also draws on the human experience. And so this is a human history, and is also a history that is rooted in love and care. So as a historian, I am grateful to Toby's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you for the opportunity for me to come to your celebration and to celebrate with you. I think tonight is precisely that moment where we celebrate you as a scholar, as a historian, as somebody whose heart is in Guinea-Bissau, I would say. Exactly. Okay, as Toby said in his lecture a minute ago, we met here at King's College 20 years ago. Little I knew that Toby will be promoted as a professor of Lusophone, Precolonial Africa, and the African history and culture. Since that time we met, we organized conferences, panels, we went to Mozambique, we went to Angola, we went to Brazil, we went to US. You can name it, countries that we have visited. We collaborated on many other things. We co-authored work together. So all of these is the great things that Toby work is reflecting, which I would like to mention a bit of it tonight. But before I do all of that, I have to say, like Elijah has just said now, Toby is a friend, Toby is a colleague, but I would say Toby is a brother to me. a brother of many years, and the best brother in the world. I mean it, Toby. That is precisely what it is. Tonight, like Anna Rauzu, I think we both are being called to be the griots, as Toby has put it. The griots are the songs or the praise singers. We are here to sing praises to Toby tonight, and that is what we're being called for. So, being the singers of praises, tonight we are going to hear a lots of superlatives about Toby. So sit tight and hear those superlatives. His works, as we know that we are celebrating tonight, in the African way, in the African tradition, or in the Mande tradition, life of a person is celebrated in 3 stages. The first stage is when Toby was born. I'm sure your mom would be very proud of you. Yeah. That is when we come to know you. But then the second stage in your life is the life of your deeds. So tonight is the life of your deeds. The next one, which will come many years, will be the life of memories, when we remember everything. But for now, it is the action of your work, what you have done, what is this work telling us, and so on and so forth. So the superlative, as I said, is the language. Your work, Toby, as Mariana has mentioned, as Anna Rauzu has said, your work has spoken to us not only here in Brazil, but also in Africa. That work, I would say, it is excellent. And this is where now I begin with the superlative. It is excellent. It is brilliant. It is outstanding. It is incredible. It is fascinating. And it is very good. Toby, as a colleague, is not just an outstanding scholar, but he is also an outstanding, I'm just feeling the echo and the thing. He is also an outstanding colleague who has helped many young scholars. We have example of that here tonight. I'm not going to embarrass Alida, but we know all of that. And not only that, Toby has helped colleagues. Toby has read my work. I would say all of my work I have published, Toby has read it. So, for that reason, Toby is a colleague who also is able to transcend the limit of cultures. To be able to be a historian of culture or Africa, then you have to transcend that limit of cultures and so on. So, Toby, I will give you a name tonight, just for tonight. Maybe you want to keep that name. I would call you Ganagoga. A Ganagoga is a name used by the Cape Verdean historian to talk about people who left Europe at the time who were in Africa. They were able to speak many languages and be able to transcend from one culture to another. So Toby is like that. In his work, he worked on Brazil, he worked on Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and you can name many other countries and so on. So to be a historian, you have to be a Ganagoga. You have to learn the language. Because the history that we are talking about today, the history of Africa or the history of European, since the period of 15th century or beyond that, those history has intersected. Because of that intersection that Toby talked about, to be able to do it, we are not only going to rely on the language of the European alone. The history of Africa is written from the soil of Africa, which meant it takes the culture, meaning nuances that come from that culture. How are we going to read it? We're not going to use only the English language. We can't rely on in the Portuguese language alone. We can't rely on French language, Dutch, Spanish, and so on. We have to learn Kumbundi of this world. We have to learn the Balanta of Guinea-Bissau. We have to learn the Guarani of Brazilian language. To be able to engage with that, and that's what it takes. I think for that, a lot of historians are trying to avoid it, but you haven't avoided it. You have engaged with it. So, colleagues here tonight, I think Toby's work is asking or challenging us to think much more critically. But rather than this critical thinking of a distance out there in Africa, this African history is here in Britain. Because since 15th century, Europe went to Africa, Africa intersects with Europe, that changes is here. We can't ignore it. We have to deal with it. The fact that I'm here speaking to you, I'm from Guinea-Bissau, meaning that you're going to have to engage with me, as Toby has done. So history is to do with language. Language, as I said, we often think that language is just for people to learn the language to be able to speak it. But as a historian, we have to. We have to learn that language, we have to master it, and we have to do it as things should be. So to continue with celebration of Toby's work, as we've been talking about, I want to conclude by asking us, in this great night of celebration, what is Toby's work asking us to do? I'm not going to answer that question. I think Anna Rose has attempted to do that. Mariana also earlier has said something about the beautiful work of Toby. But what is it asking us to do? I will answer my side. I leave your answer to your side, but I'm going to answer for what I think what it is. It is asking us for an engagement. Engagement with the outside world, but this outside world is also here with us. So that engagement will bring in very uncomfortable questions. But what is it? Doing history, as Anna Rose has said, history is not just things that are written in the tablet, in the stone. These are the experiences of people. Suffering of people. So how are we going to deal with it? We have to engage with it. And that is my answer. I think Toby's work will continue to speak to us, not only in the UK, but also around the world. So thank you very much, Toby, for your great work, and that's what we need to celebrate tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. That was a fantastic story, history, rich narrative that you've woven together. And Toby, I'm going to invite you to come back onto the stage. We've got time for just a few questions to segue us into drinks. So we've not got too much time, but it would be great to have a few questions before we finish. Who would like to go first? And maybe while you're thinking of those questions, oh, we've got one there, okay. And there's a roving mic. Oh, I'm holding it. In that case, I can rove to you.
Hi, Toby. Yeah, really brilliant evening. Really appreciate all those voices. And the question I had is, what is Toby's work asking us to do? Was a question that we've just been asked, and I wondered what your answer might be to that.
Yes.
I think, what is my work asking us to do? Read books. To talk, discuss, and learn. Yes. From the many perspectives like we've heard this evening, yes.
Do you want to say a little bit more about your call towards the end about orality and what we can learn in terms of academic discourse from orality? Because that was really fascinating, and I'd love to know a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, for me, orality is a mode of thought, a mode of discussing, a mode of learning, a mode of listening, and we're constantly in this institution, I'm sure many others in this country, talking about modes of assessment. It seems to me that, the idea that a 2,500 word essay is necessarily, the best mode of assessment is something that people have talked about. But, I think Oral assessments, especially in the world of AI, I think oral assessments should definitely be something that we're considering much more carefully. I mean, for all the assessment changes that we hear, I don't often hear talk of oral assessments. I think that, for example, might be one thing that we could think about. I think, in general, you know, I think it used to be the case that somebody in a professorial role, the role didn't involve necessarily publishing monographs every 3 years. It involved giving lectures and speaking, and I think that also is something that perhaps we could all consider.
Thanks. And there was another question. We've got 2 more, I think, John.
Thank you, Toby. Nick Westcott. On the question of languages, obviously, a large part of your message is that listening is also an integral part, and for that we need to understand the languages in which people are speaking.
Yeah.
But I got a hint of that you were sympathetic to those who said French and English are no longer so relevant. But many Africans chose to use those languages because they wanted to be heard,
yeah,
and appropriated them. And I wonder whether you think that is a relevant point to consider. Thank you.
No, I mean, I'm not. I think it's clearly the case that yes, you know, that those decisions were taken in the 1960s. You know, there are many people on the continent who still don't think that was necessarily the right thing to do. Ngugi is one of them, and there are many others. I think what in many ways I'm making a plea for is multilingualism and the valences of multilingualism, and which, you know, and the variety of languages which that can encompass, which does go beyond the languages which Jose mentioned, you know, the traditional languages. I think, you know, there is a need for multiple languages, because with those, you know, if we're fortunate and privileged enough to speak a number of languages, we understand how differently we think in different languages and how important that is in terms of creating moments of understanding between peoples. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think, there's one more question at the back. We'll take that as our last question, if we may. If you do this again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you for your very fascinating lecture. But my question is about multiple languages. These multiple languages, do they have to be European? Because there are local languages that convey nuances and meanings more than the European languages.
Yeah.
So if you then don't speak those languages, how do you go ahead to apprehend some of the multiple meanings that are embedded in what people are saying? Well, I've listened to your friend. How much of what he has said is his own?
How much of it is? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think as Jose said, and as I talked about, you know, it's something which takes time. You know, for a scholar, for example, it takes time. And that's something which, again, we don't have a lot of in the Western Academy. So I think that's something else that I would make a plea for is more time. Because without it, that work is almost impossible to do. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Toby. The seafood and drinks being set up at the back. So I just want to say finally, I think my answer to the question of what is your work asking us to do,
Yes.
I think it's asking us to think about the consequences of our actions within a global network and to reconfigure our sense of that global network to see those consequences differently and to flip things around. And I think that was what was so incredibly insightful about and urgent about the work that you did on COVID, but it's also the same theme really that's running through A Fistful of Shells. So that's the answer I would give to that question. We can talk more about, we'd like to hear everybody's answers to that question as we grab a drink and we can toast Toby once again.
Okay.
Thank you very much.